So, hi everybody. Really happy to welcome you to this meeting. Well, it's more than a meeting. It's actually, in some ways, it's a celebration. It's organised jointly with Repeater Books, who've published Marcus Gilroy's one of, well, maybe both. I don't know if they're both launched today, but he's produced two books. When I went on Amazon to buy the one being discussed today, I found two were being launched today. So Repeater Books is here and organising this event to launch Marcus's book, which he'll talk more about. And Red Pepper is here to launch its wonderful issue on struggles for truth, in which Tom Konda has written a brilliant article about conspiracy theorists, particularly in the US. And obviously the context of Trump, and so this is to both celebrate these two publishing events, these two, in a way, interventions in the struggle for truth, because the struggle for truth is about ideas and debate and information and critical information, particularly. I'm Hilary Wainwright, a founding editor of Red Pepper. And Red Pepper's really pleased to be co-hosting this event and hope to co-host more with Repeater Books, which is a very exciting, relatively new publisher, but it's made a big impact already. So what I want to do, we've got three amazing panelists. Tom Konda, who's the author of Conspiracies of Conspiracies and a professor emeritus of political science at State University, New York. And he's written this really excellent article in the latest issue of Red Pepper. And in the chat, you'll see how to subscribe to Red Pepper, because it's not expensive. And actually, it's much, you can read things online, but it's much more comfortable to have the magazine, lying in your loo in your kitchen. You can take it on the tube, it's just, it can be part of your life in the way in which, the computer is part of your life, but not quite so flexible. And then we'll have Sarah Jaffe, who I've met and I can tell you is the most amazing speaker and writer on Labour, particularly, but on many things, and is going to be speaking next, particularly maybe from a Labour organising perspective, but that's up to her. And then finally, we'll have Marcus Gilroy, who is this brilliant author producing two books in one go. And he's written a very good article on the Red Pepper website, which again will be in the chat, the address for that. And I can really recommend it. And I'm looking forward to hearing them and then opening the debate and discussion with you. Maybe after they've finished, I'll ask one or two questions just to kind of warm up the discussion. But I hope, knowing Red Pepper readers, that you won't need much warming up and that you're already preparing your thoughts, your questions, and your comments. So over to Tom Konda. And I'm going to be firm but friendly. So if we've asked the opening speakers to speak for, insofar as my voice will allow me, to speak for 5 to 10 minutes. So I will start being very firm if it goes on to 10 minutes. Thanks, Tom.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you. With the idea being that truth is a theme for this, and we have not only just been through our election, which challenged truth, but we have also now been through the challenge of the election, the challenge against the election, both rhetorical and then most recently physical. And today, I'm not sure if people know this in the UK, is the 4th of March, which is the date when the president used to take office back through the 1930s and was supposed to generate another attack of some nature on account of no really good reason, just it being the 4th. But in any event, we've been dominated by Q-Anon and the cult of Donald Trump in our politics for some time. And a lot of people here have written articles and had panel discussions and so forth, not only just lately, but over the last few years, really concerned about the state of, um, well, the state of truth, post-truth era, the fact that many people seem to be essentially unreachable from the standpoint of truth, and they're having a difficult time seeing a way to get either back to a politics where truth does matter, or slogging through to a new position where the truth does matter. My focus has been on conspiracy theories, including, of course, the Q-Anon, but that's just the most recent manifestation. And that perspective always leads me to look at the largest sort of picture that I can, because the problem, as I see it, is that people who find themselves in the clutches of a conspiracy theory like these people have essentially created a wholly alternate reality for themselves. To some degree, they've been helped along by entrepreneurs who want them to believe an alternate reality, but eventually they do come to believe it. And thus, the way they approach things, their actual thought processes are different in that they start from a different place with a set of beliefs, not just attitudes or opinions or notions, but actually deep seated beliefs that are alternate and that then determine everything about how they see things. The election that we just had, they charged, was rigged. Well, elections are rigged from time to time, or elections are stolen, or elections are corrupted in some way or another. We can deal with that from the standpoint of if we see some sort of questionable circumstance, it can be investigated by journalists, by anyone really. And it may turn out that there was something wrong with an election. It may turn out that there was even a level of systemic corruption in an election. That's what we're thinking when we think about an election, whether or not it was honest, whether or not it was fair, whether or not the results should stand. These people don't begin there. They begin with the preconceived notion that there is a conspiracy that's even larger than that, that it encompasses a bewilderingly wide array of things, and that the corruption of the election was just one of those things. So when we will try to establish the narrow truth of certain things, like in the court cases that came along, there were several of them, dozens of them, I believe, that showed that there was no particular problem. They're not convinced by that. That's not the way they operate. They know there was a problem. They know that up front. They know that it was corrupted. They know who was behind it. They know it was pedophiles. They know all this stuff. That makes it very, very difficult to reestablish a notion of truth, because what you're trying to establish is basically a notion of a correct reality. And if they don't have that correct reality, they're not going to pay attention to any sort of narrower concerns about, did this happen? Did that happen? What does it mean? And so forth. That's continuing on. We're not done. The sorts of people who attacked the Capitol building in Washington, I suppose some of those people have had the scales fall from their eyes, but for the most part, they're just continuing on, anticipating that things are going to, that they're going to continue the fight from their standpoint because they've seen nothing, they can see nothing that will tell them that the election was fair and honest. All they can see is that somehow the forces of evil managed to defeat them, at least in the short run, and they'll continue along. I may have used up my 5 minutes. I don't know. I can only see myself now, so I have no input coming into me. There it is. I don't know. Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, you've got 4 minutes.
I've got 4 minutes. That's
Tom,
fine.
4 minutes.
I'm sorry?
3.
3. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, you got 3 more minutes.
I suspect that the problem is not going to go away. I know that we were supposed to deal with this later. And the question of how do you try to reestablish a politics, not a politics of truth, but a politics that actually takes truth into account. And that's tied in with sustaining democracy, because presumably democracy depends upon the intelligent action of the sovereign people. If those people are being manipulated, if those people are subject to cultish sort of thinking, if those people are embroiled into conspiracy or conspiratorial thinking, then it's hard to see what's going to bring that back. There have been a lot of suggestions, but I haven't seen any that fill me with a great deal of confidence. I really have nothing else to say right now. I'm just waiting to see what sorts of questions people have. So I'll cede my time.
All right. Well, I guess I'll just go ahead and jump in then.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sarah. I'm also American like Tom, so that means that I've also been thinking a lot about the election we just had and the ongoing challenge of the ongoing challenge of talking to people who, as Tom was saying, live in a different reality than I do. And
then on what's to be done. So let's have Sarah. Sarah, go ahead.
Yes, okay.
Hi, Sarah.
Anyway, hello. Yes, I was talking, so I'm a bit confused. I don't know how much of a delay we have now. Anyway, okay.
Sorry.
So I have thoughts on conspiracy theories, thoughts on the destruction of journalism, and all of those things that I think we'll probably get into at some point. But when I was considering what to say about truth before this, I actually started thinking about the way that, sort of hand in hand with a conspiracist alternate reality, the right wing, particularly in the US, but also in the UK and elsewhere, also adopts this pose of telling difficult truths. And the first thing, of course, that I thought of on this front is Margaret Thatcher, is there is no alternative, right? That this dates quite a ways back to telling us that we cannot do anything but submit to the way things are. There is no such thing as society. There is no alternative. There is no choice. We are just stuck with however miserable things must be. I was looking at Twitter earlier today, which is always a mistake, but there was a video of Brazilian, head of state Bolsonaro telling people essentially to stop crying about the fact that their death toll is astronomical. And yeah, essentially, how long are you going to keep crying? Well, as long as people keep dying unnecessarily, probably. But there's a right-wing commentator named Ben Shapiro, who, if you don't know who he is, count yourself lucky and keep it that way. But his sort of tagline is facts don't care about your feelings. And so I'm sort of fascinated by this framework, this very gendered framework in which the right is manly men telling you serious truth, even when it's Margaret Thatcher. And the left, or anybody who suggests that society might be a little bit different than it is right now, is a bunch of whining little children, little girls, mostly. And that the response to the right in sort of mainstream American politics has been this sort of march for science, follow the science, invocation of some imagined truth, that if we could just tell people the truth, that, as Tom was saying, the scales will fall from their eyes and they'll realize their mistakes and come back home. And if anybody has a family member or friend who has gotten into QAnon, telling the truth does absolutely nothing. I'm a journalist. This is what I do for a living. I really wish that telling people the truth was enough to make everything change, but it isn't, which is why I write about organizing and social movements and the labor movement in particular, because I actually don't think that the way things will change is just by telling people the truth. I think you actually have to do politics. So I wanted to wrap up my few minutes here with talking about the way that this idea of truth and this sort of right-wing spin on what the truth is and how we have to face it gets put on the working class in particular. Because we wind up hearing about in the media the working class as if it too is this eternal, never-changing truth, and also very masculine, right? The workers are white men. They live in the Red Wall or the Rust Belt or coal country or whatever. They wear flat caps or trucker hats, and they like racism and beer and Brexit and Trump. And they don't like wokeness, which is everything from getting a college degree, acknowledging that racism is a thing, or changing perceptions of gender and how it works. So we even get this thread on the left of people who will tell you all of these hard truths about who the workers are and what they want. And, you know, as if the workers are a stable, static category of human that exist in some space and time that is eternal, unchanging, and true. And I have some thoughts about how this is related to the fact that we don't have functional journalism anymore, but I'm going to cut myself off for now and hand it over to Marcus.
Right. Well, thank you both, Tom and Sarah. That's given me a lot to.
Okay, Simon,
to
we'll come back to the question of the role of the labour movement. Marcus.
Sorry, I didn't hear that, Hilary. I think there might be a bit of a delay.
Okay, no, so I just said that we'd, thanks to Sarah, and that we'll come back to the question of the role of the labour movement in countering fake news. It's not enough to simply think they can just tell the truth. So over to you, Marcus.
Thank you. And as I said, thank you to Sarah and Tom, because you've given me a lot to say. And I think rather than my prepared remarks, I might try to just kind of synthesize from what you said. I think, you know, my interest in this comes partly from the fact that I teach young journalists, aspiring journalists, but I come from outside of journalism. And so I come with in a sense, untainted politics from the kind of overall industrial history of journalism and the set of cultural traditions that the industry as a whole has, which are quite kind of self-protective. So if there's going to be a conversation about the truth, if there's going to be a conversation about post-truth and fake news, then I think that everything needs to be on the table as far as us kind of answering those kinds of questions. And so, you know, my first book was just being finished when Trump was elected. And I had a bit of an extension, thanks to Repeater Books. I had about 3 weeks of an extension to reflect on that, because I had a wager with them that Trump would win. They said Trump wouldn't win. So I had a chance to kind of reflect on this. And I sort of followed up on that in the next book that came out in November. And I think the thing is, I discovered there's a lot of misinformation in the way we talk about misinformation and disinformation, and the sort of decline of the truth. And so both Tom and Sarah have already kind of spoken on different elements of this. I'm going to see if I can remember which bits of this. But I think to start with, I suppose it's always bothered me, or it's bothered me over the last few years in terms of how we have tried to make sense of so-called post-truth, that much of the analysis, the sort of mainstream liberal analysis, hand-wringing about Trump and trying to figure out how this happened, was blaming the left for inventing postmodernism and therefore destabilizing the truth. I heard that a lot. A number of books were published to that effect. And, you know, I don't want to make a straw man, but I feel that that's something that deserves an answer from those who are interested in ideas, and it deserves an answer from the left. And I feel that when you look at the history of neoliberalism, you find that actually, first of all, the left has been, at least in the West, nowhere near power since the 70s. So how we can be held responsible for things that have happened in the last 4 decades, you know, and counting, is sort of a bit beyond me. But also, there's a way in which what has happened is that misinformation and untruth have been absolutely systematized and built into the kind of ideological functioning of the world, right? And so there's a structural origin in misinformation and disinformation that we need to talk about, right? There are ways that we convince ourselves that certain things are true when they're not, and that's true with almost everyone, including many of us on the left, but certainly sort of other kind of political camps as well, to a smaller or larger degree. But also then, when you look at things like conspiracy theories, for me, they're a really great way of evidencing the fact that, you know, misinformation and disinformation have a structural origin. Misinformation, you know, conspiracy theories do not come out of nowhere. They aren't some sort of strange pathology of the informational landscape that sort of is inexplicable, right? They come, and Tom alluded to this a little bit already, they come from the fact that the world is conspiratorial, right? They come from the fact that there are conspiracies everywhere. They just aren't the ones that these, you know, the Q-Anon believers or truthers or anti-vaxxers or anti-5G people or whatever think they are. And so in that kind of misplacing of, you know, how do we make sense of a world that is corrupt, you know, where power is corrupt, where there are conspiracies, people are also not equipped with the knowledge they need to make sense of that kind of complicated and corrupt and difficult world. And so their kind of underlying instinct that they probably are being conspired against is then easily redistributed towards other targets and colored by other narratives that actually take people further away from the truth. And yet, of course, we know that, and this is the little bit where I suppose where we are, what we're blamed for. I wince when people say the truth, above all, the most important thing that we need to hold on to is the truth, because I know that actually it is far too simple. I think we would all agree, just to kind of, I mean, to insist on the truth in a simplistic, positivistic way. The thing that has been reified and systematized is lying, but actually the truth is a much more difficult thing to discern and to identify and to track down. So I suppose that hopefully that connects some of the dots there. Sarah made an interesting point about gender. And I think implicitly its relationship to positivism and the way in which it's often men who are kind of sort of emboldened by this sense that they are possessors of rationale and truth. And I wanted to kind of add something to that, I suppose, in a way, because in my chapter on conspiracy theories, I found myself reading a bit of Rebecca Solnit, where she talks about the fact that actually it is so often men who confidently peddle bullshit as sort of part of the way they're you know, these kinds of narratives. So it doesn't mean that conspiracism is necessarily more male or female. I don't want to get into that, but I think there are really interested interesting gendered patterns to the way these things spread, which perhaps we can talk about a little bit more. But there was a section in Men Explain Things to Me, that essay by Rebecca Solnit, where she talks about the number of men she has experienced who just really, with no holding back, just sprout things that are completely untrue and unhelpful and unfounded. And that sort of the confidence to do that, I think, is something that perhaps, you know, we can factor into our overall cultural analysis of the politics of truth. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, Marcus, that's really interesting. I've turned off my camera because my sound, I'm only able to use my phone at the moment because my computer's broke, and so it sounds very bad. So I've turned off my camera. So maybe we should just have a little bit of discussion between the panel on some of the issues that have been raised, and then go into the general discussion. So maybe we should pick up on Marcus's point about truth. So that probably, I don't know whether everybody would share Marcus's point. Certainly I would, that truth isn't out there as a simple thing to be struggled for in that positivistic way. Nevertheless, there is a reality that we can discover, and it's always a process of argument to discover, you know, more or less what the truth is, sufficiently to act without being certain, and always knowing that the approximation we make to the truth will be constantly revised as a result of experience. But there is some intersubjective reference, if you like, to be able to have the debate. But I wonder whether Marcus would like to say more about his understanding of truth, and whether Sarah and Tom could also share, so that at least we've got some common starting point in terms of our understanding of truth, and therefore the conditions of being able to argue about the truth and assert a truth against a falsehood. I mean, obviously we can't solve this problem, but we could at least clarify a bit further.
I can say something if you like.
Okay.
I've always shied away from even using the words "the truth" because I fear that it's going to raise the specter of philosophy, and I just prefer to try to consider whether or not things are true, which is different somehow from the truth. That always seems just to raise the stakes to a point where I'm not comfortable. If things are true, as you were just saying, they can be hashed out. You can try to verify things. You can try to get to understand things. That little segment that you, Hillary, just laid out is exactly what people do. It's what we want people to do, even people with whom we disagree. We want to be able to have that common ground so that we can say, well, perhaps this is the best way to proceed. We take these things into account. You apparently don't take them into account, or you see it differently, or whatnot. That's old time democracy, I suppose. And it's not just very recently, but with regard to things like global warming, you try to do that, but then instead of people who disagree with you on a little point, you simply have people who deny that it exists. And they deny it not on the basis of any of that evidence or any of that thinking, of any of those things that individually may or may not be true and can be looked at like this or like that, but just on the basis of, no, it is a hoax. It is made up by, it doesn't really matter whom, but it's made up by whatever scapegoats they choose to have it made up by. And of course, that's the other panelists were both each in his or her own way talking about the structure of what promulgates that sort of thinking. I tried to allude to it too by referring to entrepreneurs. I think there are a great many people out there who don't believe what they're saying at all. They're simply using it in order to cultivate the thinking or the non-thinking of other people to get them to go along with it. I'm sure there are lots of people who don't believe that there is in fact a group of pedophiles that are under the control of Hillary Clinton, but nevertheless spread that around, and then other people continue to believe it. But in any event, I just wanted to say that. So other people, go ahead, please.
Sarah, after you.
Oh, all right. Yeah,
okay,
I think
Sarah,
it was
do you want to
interesting.
come in on this? I mean,
Yeah.
particularly.
Yes. So I think, and this is obviously, again, like I'm a journalist, I have to sort of make these calculations kind of every day. And I thought it was interesting the way, Hillary, you phrased it as truth isn't a thing to be struggled for, because I actually think truth is a thing that is constantly struggled over, right? That it is something that is produced sort of, I just get really wankily Marxist here and say dialectically, but like that also relates to how I think about the world and what is true and what are facts is like, there are things that are real, right? I am on this panel right now. I'm staring at my computer. I am in New York City. I have a glass of water next to me. I'm 40 years old. So those are things that are true that I can trace and back up. But then following from that, there's a whole lot of gray area that can be negotiated over. And that negotiation is politics, it's society, it's life, it's how we make meaning. And not, again, to get too philosophical about it. But in doing journalism, I find that who you're talking to shapes a lot of what gets told as true. So, again, I was talking to Amazon workers the other day, and contra a lot of the discourse about automation, the Amazon workers in a warehouse that has a lot of robots, they liken them to Roombas. One of the workers said to me, if we're counting on these things to be Terminators, I dare anybody to come in and work with them for a little while. The robots essentially just exist to speed up the workplace. And that's a very different truth than what you hear about these things in the endless number of books that I'm asked to review about automation. So the question of, what are facts and what is true, I think are sort of different, but often mistaken for being the same thing. Because as Tom was saying, you sort of can't win an argument with somebody who just says global warming isn't real. I can't argue that with someone, right? We have to find a spot where we agree on something to get somewhere. And yeah, I always find myself in the strange position of, as a journalist, arguing for the limited utility of facts.
I'm not sure whether I should speak or
Okay.
or come.
Is there anybody in the audience wanting to join this discussion? Or maybe Marcus?
I was just going to say a couple of things
Marcus,
there.
do you want to come in on this?
Yes, please. Yes. So a couple of things, actually, just to kind of, firstly, I would say that makes for a wise journalist, someone who's kind of reluctant to kind of take those sorts of, make those positivistic arguments about the truth and make out as though the truth is easy to find. I think there are a couple of strands that I would like to bring into this discussion. Now, academic Marxian academics are always kind of likely to provoke an eye roll when talking about neoliberalism. So perhaps there are other ways that we can talk about this. But there are two things really that just have to be kind of at the center of a discussion about, the difficulty of talking about truth and and post-truth and misinformation and all of the various different phenomena that we have, conspiracy theories. And one of them is the sort of conversion of societies really to being exchange-based, entirely kind of market-driven in their thinking, and the ways that has changed the question of value, because it seems to me when you're in a world in which not only do people not value being right, being correct about the things that are easy to ascertain factually, and they're also not really that interested in taking steps to protect our environment. They're not that interested in bringing about better healthcare or voting for governments that will best serve the common interest. Then you have to ask questions about the way we value things and the way that's changed. And there is a history to that, which some people would call neoliberalism. I think the problem with that word is it refers to too many different things. So what I try to call it is the market-driven society. And that's kind of based on the work of Colin Lees, who talked about market-driven politics. But I think that when you understand that the question of value and has been substantially altered by the way we have organized our society around the exchange and around commodification, so that things like the truth, complicated as it might be, stop really mattering that much and stop being valued within that kind of way of conceptualizing things. It's no wonder that we sort of see some of these problems start to happen. That same market-driven thinking, of course, is what produces a lot of the performative bullshit that we see. It's also what produces a lot of the corruption that drives many of the kind of conspiracist thinking and this kind of half-baked ideas about Bill Gates and vaccines and all the rest of it. A lot of that is also a kind of tacit recognition of market-driven thinking. The other thing that I wanted to mention that kind of I think really is important is the sort of the lickspittle, the sidekick of this market-driven process is actually a much older one that's really about formal liberalism and its relationship to Enlightenment thinking and freedom of speech and these kinds of questions, science and facts and truth and freedom of speech and so forth, many of which are very important concepts, but the ways that they have been hollowed out into kind of meaningless token words that are used by the likes of Ben Shapiro and so forth actually further erodes our sort of tenuous grip on the so-called truth and makes it less likely, not more, that we would be able to kind of establish those kinds of consensuses. And the problem is that liberalism, it's not neoliberalism, it's liberalism, has been the sort of, if you like, the shiny veneer on the system of neoliberal capitalism that has given us so many of these problems. It has been the thing telling us, gently, don't rock the boat, equality and rights and everything, many of which again are important concepts, but it's done those in a very hollowed out way that's not very serious and that invites a certain degree of skepticism because of the other ways in which that liberal positivism is so simplistic. And as a result, we turn in on the middle. Now, again, the nomenclature of how we talk about left, right, and center and so forth, to me is a bit tired. And in the research I did for my more recent book, I found that mostly it doesn't hold. But just for a second, if we talk about left, right, and center, it seems to me that on the left, those of us who have been sort of studying these things, we've had about 170 odd years and counting of talking about, the complex structural. I mean, Marx and Engels talked about, in the German ideology, talked about the sense of the camera obscura, right? That the prevailing ideas of the ruling class cause us to see things upside down, and as a sort of metaphor, right? There is already that. So it's not a surprise to us that power is corrupt and power exercises that corruption by altering what can be known about the world, right? But I think you'll find that because there's been that sort of alliance until recently between the neoliberal forces in our society and the right, especially through the Cold War, when the communism was the common enemy, that now there's a lot more shock especially since the financial crash, that actually, hold on a second, these systems in which we had invested so much, systems of exchange and kind of formal structure that supposedly reified this kind of script around upward mobility and work hard and you'll be successful and the American dream, when it turns out that those things have been, you know, hollowed out and that was a sort of insincere positivistic way of just keeping those at the top there, then suddenly there's a much sharper degree of anger and suspicion at the rightward end of the political spectrum, which I think is what we're seeing now. And so, I mean, I hope that offers something, but I think we can't really make sense of that unless we first look at the kind of complex relationship between, you know, neoliberal market-driven sort of domination of culture and democracy and hollowing out of it. Wendy Brown is really good on this. And then the kind of assistance from a kind of left-sounding, but not actually left-wing at all, liberalism that sort of espouses these positivistic concepts. And that, to me, is sort of what links the dots, you know, between, you know, conspiracist thinking, post-truth and Trump, and the kind of general wave of nationalism and reactionary politics we see in Europe as well and other places.
Marcus, this is really brilliant. And we now need to go into questions because there are a lot building up, but I just want to give a plug to your book where presumably all this is expanded on, which is After the Fact, The Truth About Fake News. And you can get it from Repeater Books. And the paperback is £7.99. And I really recommend it on the basis of what you've just been saying. Now the trouble is, I'm wondering whether Charlotte, is she there? Because could she read out the questions? Because I can't. I don't think I can get them on my phone, as well as kind of chair the meeting. Is that okay?
Okay. I will bring in the first question for the audience for us all. Unexpected interruption into this meeting for me. So the first question is from Eleanor Potts, and she says...
Okay, so I've got one question from Potts. Okay.
Okay, so the question is...
Yeah, you go ahead, Charlotte.
You've alluded to us being in the age of disinformation. Where do we go from this, and what might the next defining media trend be?
The age of disinformation. I was listening just a moment ago to what Marcus had to say, and if I try to link that in with this question, it brings me back to an idea that I've had for some time, which is the menace of commercial information as opposed to democratic political information or even scientific information. Information has different points within these different structural contexts. Each one can be corrupted, but if they're taken purely, then scientific spread of information, like in journals and so forth, is actually designed to try to get at the truth. It may not. Democratic information is designed to debate issues. Commercial information is designed to convince people of things, to buy things, to accept things, to vote for things. And at least in the United States, going back to the election of Richard Nixon, the selling of the president, when this first came up as an issue, the replacement of democratic, and I don't mean Democratic Party, I just in a democracy, of the type of information, self-interested or not, right or wrong, but simply information that was that made sense within that framework, has over the decades been slowly replaced by professional public relations people and advertising ideas. And that shows up not just in politics, it showed up years ago a long time ago in Alabama, where I'm from, when people wanted it to appear that there were more Black people at a football game of Auburn University or any, and so they simply photoshopped some into the crowd scene. The point that I came away with from that was, even then, this has to be 30 years ago, when they were challenged for having done that, they literally could not see anything wrong with it. They literally, one of them actually said, I'm paraphrasing because it's been a long time, but there are Black people who go here. There could have been some at the game. They literally were incapable, and that's a sort of hollowing out. That's what I was driven back to when Marcus talked about the information being hollowed out. Is a whole different approach to information that has nothing to do with governing. It has nothing to do with normal politics. It's simply orchestrated by people, of course, who have the money and the power to do it, to create realities for people, to convince people of things. That was just my thought.
Okay. Yeah, I'm more.
Thanks, Tom.
Yes, I seem to be caught in a spider web.
Maybe. I'm going to ask others to comment before we move on to the next question.
Yeah.
So Marcus and Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So I don't know if I agree that we're in an age of information, actually. I kind of think we've always been in one, but we are in an age of a crisis of journalism. And that does have real effects for how we acquire information. As Tom was saying, we are in a period of sort of commercial information. But what we're also in, and you'll have to accept my apology for being American and thus knowing more about the political economy of American media than elsewhere. But newspapers are dying. They are dying at a rapid rate. They're also dying in most of Europe, as far as I know. And that means that local news is getting underreported. And instead, where they're not dying, they're being consolidated. So a couple of corporations own a vast number of newspapers and publish mostly the same thing in all of them. And it's not just... It is definitely true that those corporations have a slant. Rupert Murdoch is a, cancer on both sides of the ocean. But it's also just true that there's much less news gathering going on in a lot of these places than there would have been 50, 60 years ago. And that shapes so much of how we understand the world. And that is, it's happening at the same time as the destruction of a lot of other industries, where a lot of people are suddenly unmoored from the material realities of their life that they had gotten used to or had expected to have. So I have a note here about sort of the collapse of a certain way of working that is, again, very gendered, and I can talk about that forever, but I'll restrict myself at this moment. But that when the factory in your town has disappeared, when the way that most people expected to live their lives no longer works, when the college degree that you have gotten does not get you the job that you were told it would get you. Conspiracy theories are an attempt to understand the world. They are an attempt to understand a changing world. In that changing world, people are getting less reliable local information. And instead, they're getting more of their information filtered through a much smaller number of places. And then you can bring in the algorithms and all of these things that Marcus, I'm sure, can talk about because he spent more time researching them than I have. But we're facing this crisis because people are actually in crisis in their everyday lives.
Okay,
But
Sarah,
that's
great. And can I give a plug to Sarah's book? which relates to some of what she said, which is that it's got a very good title, Work Doesn't Love You Back. And let's quickly get Marcus in. We've got some great questions coming. So Marcus, over to you.
Great. Well, I'm going to interpret Anna's question slightly differently. I mean, much as there's a lot of, but I agree with everything Tom and Sarah have said. So I'm going to go back to the question. The last bit of it, where do we go from this? What might the defining media trend be? I mean, I don't think I can make predictions about any kind of trend, sadly. But what I think one thing we can do, and I've been asked this quite a lot in relation to the book coming out, is the question of where we go and how we address this problem. Now, because I don't think that this is just a media problem, I don't think that you can have only a media solution to it. I think that this is a problem that comes from the economic and political structures of how we've built the world, especially in the last few decades. And so I think that for us to really see some of these problems go away, we sort of have to address those structures. Now, this is not an easy thing for us to do because we're, not really in a position of having the power to do that, at least not quickly, not for tomorrow. But we do, I think we can start to have a set of imaginative and strategic conversations about what that might look like. And I think that one of the things that, has to kind of come back into this, and in my book, I trace its exit more than I trace its possibility of returning, but is the common good, the idea that actually there is something that of a common good that we can sort of, organize our societies around. That the idea that common good, that organizing principle would be the marketplace, is something that I think, whatever your politics, you have to look at the world and say, well, this surely is discredited. Anything else is cognitive dissonance. You can't possibly argue that this is working. So there has to be another organizing principle. And it's very interesting to me to see politicians like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, both of course, with their limitations, but still come very close, really. I know we're kind of, maybe disappointed that they didn't get further, but both come actually much closer than they're given credit for being able to bring those ideas certainly back into the political mainstream, but almost into power. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's, a Labour defeat in December might have been considered a huge failure, but actually he achieved at least as many votes as the middle kind of Tony Blair government did when Labour won the second election in 2001, I think. So, actually, these things are not as out of reach as the way they are reported often makes it seem. Actually, this idea of the common good is not, I think, as discredited as the sort of Starmer Labour Party might wish it to appear, and same in America, and I think in the United States, and I do think that we're going to have a chance to kind of build. It's not about being there is no such thing as the extreme left, really, in Western societies. We're not trying to do anything. The idea that it would be radical simply just to make society more democratic and more inclusive and give everybody a bit more opportunity is hardly radical. But I think if you do those things, you alleviate some of these structural problems, you will start to see some of these informational problems also recede. If you invest in education, invest in kind of just making those structures go away, then these other things will recede, I think. So for me, that's where the future has to be. I can't say that there are media trends other than things like what Repeater Books is already doing, which is kind of amplifying and foregrounding new voices in the conversation. And Red Pepper, actually, a much older institution, but very much doing that as well.
Thanks, Marcus. Okay, thanks, Marcus. I think that points to the importance of the alternative media in actually giving a platform to those voices and being a sort of champion of democracy, without which the struggle for truth can't be achieved. So let's, in the interest of democracy, move on to the other questions. I mean, we're aiming to end maybe 8:30. So let's have 2 more questions and then discussion and response to those, and then a summing up. Charlotte, can you read those questions, or maybe everybody can see them and I can't?
I'll read out our next question.
Well, I can, but not very well.
So we have a question here, which is related to Adam Curtis's new 6-part documentary, which is really interesting. What do speakers think about the points raised in Adam Curtis's recent documentary that algorithmic rationality has a relation to modern conspiracy theories, crude associations spun into a narrative?
Well, as the conspiracy theory guy, I'll take a stab at that.
Okay, I mean,
yes. Okay, here I go. I understand algorithmic rationality and those sorts of things, information silos and whatnot, as an outsider, not anything having to do with the technical aspects of it. It seems to me that the primary link between what people are normally talking about when they talk about those sorts of algorithms that bring you information that, according to the algorithm, you want, and conspiratorial thinking is, one, the ease with which people can now access conspiratorial ideas. There was a time when it was actually fairly difficult. People would mimeograph little sheets and hand them out, or you would go to some weirdo bookstore or something and find conspiratorial ideas. But now it's extremely easy, and it has, in many areas, to the point of crowding out other information because of the degree to which conspiratorial-minded people tend to be really devoted to their ideas and making sure that everybody gets at them. I have seen it written that very high percentages of all the information that you would ever see online about vaccines are in fact anti-vaxxer conspiracy theories. I don't actually know that that's true, but it certainly seems fairly plausible. I've looked up some things myself just to do Google searches and see, and it is always surprising how easy it is to get to those things. They tend to displace other information. And it's not as though then the other information is not there or doesn't exist. It's just a matter of how much time and energy are people going to put into searching for it, especially when there's something that is designed to appeal to what they want to hear right there at their fingertips. And I don't know how much of the problem of conspiratorial thinking, which I think is the ideology of the 21st century, and that it's here to stay, but how much that is because of electronic media and the algorithms that go into it. But I believe that it is a lot. There we have it.
Okay, Marcus. You're on mute.
Yes,
sorry.
Yes, sorry about that. Yes, I was just going to say, watching Adam Curtis is difficult for me because I agree with him about many of the big things, and I think he is an incredibly kind of creative and interesting filmmaker. But I think it's like difficult when you work on something that's very similar to someone else's work. You notice the small things a lot more, and you know, it can be a little bit painful sometimes, not because it's bad, but because it's just very, it's like listening to music that's slightly out of tune, maybe, although his choice of music is actually great. So I haven't, in terms of the new series, I've only watched the first episode, but I know those arguments and from Adam Curtis, and I think, you know, what can I say, that it's an interesting metaphor, you know, that the ways that the algorithms can spin meaningful data out of the data points they collect about you and then feed that back to you. You know, and he made the same point about Eliza, really, in hypernormalization. That is similar in some ways to the way I have seen the mind of a conspiracist work, you know, in the sense that you take these kind of data points, the things that you do see, the things that appear to be, you know, coincidences, but in fact they can't be, right? And you apply meaning to them. And, you know, so, I mean, often this is because there are such gaps in the knowledge that we already have, that we are in the position of trying to fill in the gaps and to create meaning where there is no meaning, right? We don't have the story, we don't have the explanation, so we make one, and so I can see that there's a kind of you know, a simile there, a good metaphorical and an analogy there. But as far as actually saying that, you know, that there may be a kind of relationship between the kind of proliferation of conspiracist thinking and the kind of algorithmic driven surveillance capitalism that we experience, I wouldn't say that that's the link that I would draw. I would refute that if that's what's being argued, because I think that actually, first of all, conspiracism has a much longer history than social media have, much longer. And before it was social media, it was things like radio and many other media forms that enable a certain degree of you know, this kind of sharing. Not the same degree, obviously, as social media, but some degree of this. And as I said, I think conspiracist thinking has its origins kind of more in the political realm. And I mean, so, okay, conspiracy theorists are much older. And there was another point as well, which, yeah, I suppose, I mean, I've slightly lost my train of thought and I can't remember the other thing that I was going to say. But I think that already for me doesn't, I don't see a causality there. I think it's kind of, we're so blasted with so many other things that are encouraging us towards conspiracist thinking that, you know, if anything, the two things would share a common origin rather than anything else.
Sarah.
Honestly, I've never watched an Adam Curtis documentary, so I have no idea the broader context of the question. I don't think algorithms are responsible for conspiracy theories, but I do think that there are decisions being made by people who program those algorithms at certain social media companies that privilege certain things. Mostly, though, they privilege profit and keeping you watching. And so, you know, there are a variety of ways that those algorithms have been changed over the years. Facebook, for instance, has gotten much harder to use if you're an organizer or anything, or a small media outlet, in fact, because you will find your things buried under the much larger outlets. But yeah, I'm sort of agree with Marcus. I don't think that algorithms are responsible for the problem that we have. I think we make the mistake quite often of treating technology. This is something that I referenced already today, like treating technology as if it is organic and teleological and inevitable and outside of the control of humans and human decision making. And that doesn't do us any good, and it doesn't help us solve human problems like how to talk to each other.
Okay, thanks everybody. So let's move on to the next question. Charlotte.
Hello. So we have a question here from Max Basto. He asks, how do the panelists define false conspiracy theories? I've seen some researchers claim that they're near universal, which seems limited for understanding the extremes of, for example, Q-Anon.
They're near universal. What does that mean?
Who wants
that? The conspiracy theories are near universal, which seems limited.
Oh, the conspiracy theories themselves are near universal. In which case, are there not some true ones? I think maybe that's what the question means. So how would we define the false ones?
There are no true conspiracy theories. There we go.
Yes.
The whole concept of a conspiracy theory is that it's a false narrative. That's not to say there are no true conspiracies. That's not to say there's been no accusations of conspiracies that turned out to be true. And as I have looked over people who've made this argument in the past, they'll turn to things that turned out to happen, like Watergate. And they will say, well, there you go. Look at that. That was a conspiracy. And you can look back at the actual news coverage as that story developed. Even it's not a conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's simply the apparent idea that there was a conspiracy, and how high did it go? Conspiracy is just a crime. People are convicted of it. That guy who had that scam where he got rich people's and celebrities' kids into schools that they couldn't otherwise get into, pled guilty to 2 counts of conspiracy. There's no conspiracy theory there. The idea of a conspiracy theory needs a theory. And the theory is that alternate reality idea. If you're based in our reality and you're talking about a conspiracy, whether or not it's one that's been established to have happened or one that you just think might happen, a simple case of bribery is conspiracy, then you're not a conspiracy theorist because you have no theory. It's the theory that makes conspiracy theories erroneous.
And yet there's an interesting element to this as well, because I guess working a lot of the research that I do involves a kind of knowledge production called theory, right? And so I've worked with, and been lucky enough to know quite a lot of theorists in a totally different sense, whose work is incredibly careful and whose object is to try to produce ways of understanding the world when empirical information is either impossible to find by its very definition, or simply not available yet. But the theorists that I know are amongst the most careful and self-critical people that I've met.
They're actually theorists.
Yes. So I think what's interesting is we've got people who theorize about the possibility of some conspiracy, and then we have the kind of capital C, capital T reified term of a conspiracy theorist, which is something very specific, which is a person who erroneously believes, right, in a kind of unfounded and unproven theory about the way they're being conspired against, which turns, may later turn out to be true or have a kernel of truth, but is probably fanciful because, as we've said, it's produced by all sorts of other patterns. There are whole problems of literacy and ignorance around the way people understand the world that mean that they're not really equipped necessarily to make sense of how and why they are being conspired against, and so then they can't, to these other kinds of answers. But I think I actually defend suspicion in my book. I think suspicion is a very important political ingredient, and I think we should be ready to deploy our suspicions when we feel that that's appropriate. But I think that when we do that, the key is that we have to be ready to self-doubt, self-criticize, and withdraw our suspicions when we are shown to be wrong. And what's interesting is the ways in which the conspiracy theorists, in this capital C, capital T kind of way that we're talking about, fails to do that. Is not really interested in doing that, and so then the whole kind of picture goes awry. I mean, you know much better than I do, Tom, but I think there's a kind of interesting distinction to make there anyway.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Oh, go ahead.
You talk about the capital C, capital T, and my rhetoric that I try to use to make that same distinction is conspiracy theory, as opposed to just conspiracy accusation, like I was saying before, which doesn't actually involve any sort of theory. And people have pointed out that as a theory, it's not, of course, falsifiable, because a conspiracy theory is the only type of theory in which any information that would undermine it can be considered part of the conspiracy. And so it just metastasizes instead of going away. Sarah, I'm sorry, I jumped in.
No, not at all. Yeah, I was going to say, right, I feel like conspiracy theory is actually not a terribly useful term, as somebody also just noted in the comments. And the thing about it, right, is like, yeah, we are sort of at all times being conspired against in some ways by a bunch of people who don't have our best interests at heart and own most of the world's wealth. You know, I write about union organizing and the fact that there is a multi-billion-dollar union avoidance industry, which often operates like a conspiracy. And if you say to somebody, you know, Walmart will dispatch a team of people on a private jet from its corporate home office to fly out to any Walmart store that has, you know, the threat of a union, you sound nuts. But that's actually true and very well documented, right? And so, you know, I try to be sort of gentle with people whose beliefs are like sort of stumbling towards the reality of this world because, you know, they haven't spent 20 years reading up on the various ways that capitalism works and changes over time the way I have. They're just waking up now to the fact that, like, oh my God, the life that I was supposed to have is shit. And nothing makes any sense anymore. And so somebody is telling me that the reason that all of this is happening is that there's a pedophile cabal led by Hillary Clinton. Well, like, you know, the Clintons did screw up your life. It's just they did that by signing NAFTA, not, you know, a pedophile cabal. And then again, there was also a pedophile cabal on Jeffrey Epstein's jet. Like, you know, it's reality is often not that different from these things. And it's that elaborate construction. I really like this in Tom's article of an alternate reality based around these things that you then sort of can't be brought back to reality from because you're convinced that you know the truth. That becomes like quasi-religious, right? It's like being in a cult.
Absolutely.
It is. And as a pragmatic matter, the reason why, to me at least, you don't sound deranged when you talk about what Walmart is up to is that it's a perfectly plausible argument, something I'm much more concerned about when I deal with conspiracy theories than truth. It doesn't bring into the picture, I don't know, lizard people. It doesn't bring in the Illuminati. It doesn't bring in Jews. It doesn't bring in the Masons. It doesn't. And conspiracy theories always go that extra step beyond where they need to go to say, yes, here are people whose motives are easy to understand. They don't care about the workers. They care about money. There are people who will work for them to try to thwart unions. Yes, of course. Is it a conspiracy? Well, it's not illegal, but of course they're conspiring. That's what they're doing for a living. It's just, it's not foolproof, just like, I don't know, self-defense for murder is not foolproof. You could make mistakes, but still, are your people that you're talking about plausible? Are their motives plausible? Does it just within itself make sense, or does it just go off into some random distance?
Yeah. Is there, I'm interested in this in your research, Tom, because you mentioned also in that article about the anti-Semitic roots of a lot of these conspiracy theories. And so I wonder, like, is there something about this sort of essentialized nature of who the enemy is evidence that is relevant to conspiracy thinking, that like it's the Jews or the Masons or the whatever, the feminists.
Yeah, well, there has to be a they.
Yeah.
And I noticed that when I saw those little bits on the late night TV shows of the CPAC, and they're talking about Dr. Seuss books. And there's, what's his name, Ted Cruz. He doesn't say that the Seuss estate or the publishers decided to do this. It's they, and he never specifies who they are, which is part of that rhetorical way to be able to leap to that point. Yes, I think that a great deal, even the QAnon stuff, is very deeply anti-Semitic, very much so. They've tried over the years to try to sanitize conspiracy theories to the point where the one that still is hanging around, that the Federal Reserve Board was a plot to steal our money, which originally was a plot that the Jews are trying to steal our money. The Ron Paul version takes out the Jews. So now who's trying to steal our money? We are. It doesn't make any sense internally, but they keep it going because they're trying to sanitize it. But you can still see it. Even the pedophilia stuff is not new. But the Masons have sort of dropped out of the picture a little bit because people don't really care about Masons that much anymore. The Illuminati come and go. Satan is still strong because there are more religious people out there than I would like to think. If you look on the really bad websites, you still see the protocols painting the Jews as not just Jews, but some sort of well-oiled machinery of destruction. And I've argued in the past that once the protocols took hold, you could not be an anti-Semite without becoming a conspiracy theorist. Now I'm drifting. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just thinking of the bit of Umberto Eco in Urfascism, where he,
very nice, yes,
where he talks about the kind of origins of fascism, and he says, well, actually, there has to be this sense of a group that, you know, is sort of a group that we can turn. The followers of fascism must feel besieged. The easiest way to solve the plot is an appeal to xenophobia, but the plot must also come from the inside. Jews, he says, are usually the best target because they have the advantage of being at the same time inside and outside. And, you know, obviously we know that these are amongst the oldest forms of conspiracy thinking, but I just, as you were talking about it, it made me think of that kind of explanation.
Right, because there are those permanent ones, and then whatever topical ones come along, feminists, trans people, the woke people.
They're all part of the same giant conspiracy, Tom. You know it, and I know it.
It's all the same, and if that sort of stuff goes away, they'll be replaced by newer ones. You know.
Mm-hmm. They all hate me because I'm a Jewish Marxist feminist, so I'm definitely running the conspiracy.
Very likely.
Okay, can we have a final question? We must carry on this discussion in other contexts because it's so important. But the final question really about what can we do, and so could use it as a sort of rounding up question. And so it's really, the main question is, what can we do to encourage investment in the new as a liquid? I want to just, in answering that, ask you as a winding up question, what you would, maybe one kind of would develop in terms of what can be done to create the conditions. I mean, really to do with democracy. How do we develop democracy against the market to be able to reclaim the truth? But maybe answer the specific question about investment as one of those possibilities. So whoever wants to begin, I don't know, up to you. Sarah, why don't you begin?
Okay. So I'm American, and I've been, drooling over wanting a BBC of our very own for quite a long time, because I do think that a public media is really important. Obviously, the BBC has plenty of problems, but those are often, caused by the inculcation of commercial methods and sort of motives into the BBC. I am just going to plug two of my friends' books on the subject: Tom Mills's book on the BBC and Victor Piccard's new book on democracy and journalism. And I'll put links to those in the chat when I'm done talking. But the thing that I think is tough is that, like, the media alone, I say this again as a journalist, is not going to solve this problem. And I actually think that it is a problem fundamentally of how we figure out how to talk to each other. And I must say, this is like very real for me. My mother is a Trump supporter, and it's quite difficult to figure out how to talk about this stuff. But I think that the solution does have to come in real face-to-face organizing a lot of the time. And you actually have to do work around things that will make people's lives materially better. And we have to do that while not tolerating for a second the kind of racism that ends up at the root of all of these conspiracy theories. Also, I'm self-interested on that front because I'm Jewish. But I was interviewing Ellen Bravo, who is a absolute hero of mine and a longtime labor organizer in the US. And she was one of the founders of a group called 9 to 5, which was an office women's organization in the 1970s. And she was talking about when you have a bunch of people in a room together who all have different issues and different sort of specific concerns and needs in their lives, and they relate to each other as humans, then it isn't a challenge to say, we've got to take up racism because you're organizing with people who don't look like you every day. It's not a challenge to say we have to take up childcare, even if you're not a parent, if you're organizing alongside people who are. If you find ways to put people into conversations and spaces and places where their needs are being met. I'm just thinking of like the basic mutual aid that has been done during the pandemic. That actually can break through a lot of things that no article I can write can do.
Well, that was good.
Tom, would you like to go next, or shall I?
Do you have something upbeat to say?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, then I'll go next, and then it will end on a higher note.
Okay.
I've read a lot of things that people have written, both here in the U.S. and conspiracy writing seems to be big also in the UK and in the Netherlands for some reason. And it's still my main concern, although the whole idea of the common good that you mentioned before is something that, separately from conspiracy theory, I've been very concerned with, because there has been a concerted effort, I think, to undermine the very notion that there is such a thing as a common good, because it certainly serves the interests of a great many people to atomize the public so that they don't organize together, they don't do anything about their collective situation. I don't see any way to get people to talk to each other. That may be just because I find it difficult myself. I don't know. I tend to agree that if people's lives can be made genuinely better in a way that they can see their common interest with other people around them and be less parochial or provincial, is going to be the long way out of this. I don't see like limiting people's access to social media as being it. I don't see the government trying to determine what's good and bad to say as any sort of solution to the problem. I see a split in the United States. I do not know if it is as bad in England as it is here, but it's terrible here. And in part, it's because I think a great many people do not, in fact, reflect on what they have to say. They just don't. So I don't actually have anything. I haven't worried about it a great deal because I'm pretty old. So I figure, well, I'll leave it to you two there to deal with that. But if we do solve it, it will be in a really big picture sort of way. And your remark about the COVID, that's exactly the sort of thing that can happen, that can break up the power structure in some sort of weird way and just simply force issues, so that perhaps when millions of people can't pay their rent and cities can't raise any taxes because there's no commercial property, things actually will change and people will see a community of interest that makes them better able to work together. But I'm still searching. So you go ahead and have something.
Here's what I'll say, and you know, I don't want to. I don't want to risk sounding like I think I have all the answers, because no. I absolutely don't. But I do know that I work with young people every day. And, you know, I think of myself as being relatively young, but they make me feel old because they're so much younger and they have so much of their lives ahead of them. And there's so much to hope for. And despite the relatively gloomy nature of my own politics, I feel that with them, they've made me work really hard to kind of actually try and think about, well, how, you know, what does a positive future look like and how can we build that? Because I think I owe it to them to do that work. And I think they deserve no less. And if that, you know, is possible, then it should happen. So one of the things we look at, obviously, is the effect of media. Because, you know, if you're making media, if you're making journalism, if you're making social media videos, if you're talking about questions of social media regulation and censorship and so forth, then you need to be able to actually ascertain what effect those media are having. And it's very common for people to make claims about the things that appear in the media, positively or negatively. You know, the Russians are doing this and that's making people vote this way, or I made a great video and I think it's going to change people's minds about this issue, or whatever. And actually, you know, scholars have struggled for years with the question of how much effect does media have. But actually, you know, in terms of my study of the kind of new right and the think tanks of the right, the IEA and the, you know, Cato Institute and all these kinds of think tanks on both sides of the Atlantic, and the kind of network that they're part of. One of the things I've seen is this, you know, kind of right-wing ideology taking kind of leftist ideas about collective working together and making institutions and putting that to kind of devastating effect. And so I suppose one of the things that I feel what I can do is just quote Milton Friedman at you quickly and say that I think that, you know, sometimes a crisis is a moment of opportunity. Obviously, Naomi Klein's written about that brilliantly. And the pandemic does represent a rupture from that kind of, you know, my students and I the other day were talking about 2019 as a year. It was kind of a shit year. You know, pandemic wasn't here yet, but it was just kind of this kind of feeling that we all remember it now as that. And how none of us really want to go back to that. We want to build forward to something else. And I think, you know, there's this idea, you know, that I guess I take from the work of Mark Fisher, which is really the sense that if there is emancipation to be done, it's in conditioning the imagination, right? We can say, yes, you know, we have to look after people's material interests. And I think that's very, very, very important. But we aren't going to have politicians who are elected to do that successfully until we have until we have managed to get enough people to imagine that that's possible and desirable. And so there's work to be done on sort of conditioning that imagination. And obviously the cards are stacked against us because there's lots of people spending quite a lot of money, as Jane Mayer has shown, in trying to undermine those possibilities. And of course, I think that you're right, that is more difficult in the US for a number of historical reasons. But I do think there's a possibility there that with the right kinds of strategy and concerted effort and media making and creativity, we can start to sort of condition the landscape a little bit differently and get people thinking and imagining new kinds of possibility. And with the as I said earlier, with Bernie and Jeremy Corbyn, we saw little flashes of that. And powers that be now like to think that because those particular politicians have gone away, those ideas will go away. Well, I don't think they will. And especially not when I speak to younger people. I think that they're going to come back again even stronger, and that we need to be doing everything we can to sort of help that. We will never get rid of kind of mean-spirited, individualist, selfish politics from the landscape, but all we need to do is marginalize it. And I believe that can be done, and that there's a possibility for that. Media are not the center of society. They will not accomplish it on their own, but there is a kind of way in which we can build institutions, we can make media, we can actually normalize those ideas to much better effect than we're doing. One of the other things I'll say kind of in relation to that, and there's a thing that if you're on the left, you're not really supposed to criticize the left, right? We have this kind of like, it's sort of forbidden, but actually, I get very frustrated with the kind of lack of tactics and strategy. Obviously, there's lots of labor organizers working very hard on that kind of strategy, but as far as media and communications, we're so bad in the sense we're always banging the drum really loudly about how ideologically pure we are. And, actually the fight really is over what's normal. It's not over what's most virtuous. And what we have to do is to work to try to make our ideas, if we believe in them that much, to make them normal, to make them unremarkable, to make them completely the starting point for everyone. And to stop trying to kind of always win the argument in this very explicit way, because we won it decades ago, but that doesn't matter unless you can make that normal. Then you don't have any possibility of kind of shifting the parameters of the conversation, and that's really where I see some possibility, at least if we can be a bit more strategic about that.
That's great, Marcus. It's a point to end. I was very worried when you began talking about how gloomy your politics were, and I'm glad you talked your way out of gloomy politics. Well, it isn't gloomy, into a politics of hope. So this has been a really, really good session, and I just recommend everybody to get to those books that have been in this conversation. That's Work Doesn't Love You Back by Sarah Jaffe, Conspiracies of Conspiracies, and by Tom Konda, To the Truth About Fake News. Also really urge you to subscribe to Red Pepper and to get your friends to subscribe, because in a way it's a tool both for organizing in the way that Sarah stressed, that sort of building up of material power, which I think is linked to what Marcus was saying, is conditioning the imagination, because it's often through struggle. If you think of the ways in which people change, it's often through themselves gaining that collective power to see glimpses of change. And so Red Pepper, in a way, I'd say, is both a tool for organizing and a means of conditioning the imagination. So please subscribe and please promote it. Without, we don't think we're ideologically pure. We don't think that journalism is going to change the world, but we do think that providing a non-sectarian platform and actually sort of telling the truth, actually telling the facts and enabling people to develop their own theories is central. So see you all again, and thanks Marcus and Tom and Sarah, and see you three again. I'd love to carry on this discussion, and I'm sorry